There we are. So I'll just get started in welcoming everybody to our Territorial Waters 2 panel today, following the panel this morning, which is also our last week, penultimate week of Living with Water. We have a few more presentations next week. So Sam and I are just really grateful for everybody who's come to present and to attend, and really excited to wrap up this week with this fantastic panel. Each presenters will have about 15 to 20 minutes to present. I will introduce each of the presenters before they go, and we'll keep the questions to the end. So make sure to make notes of your questions. You're welcome to either unmute yourself, use the raise hand function, or the chat to ask questions. If you're unable to open your camera or your mic, we can read out questions for you and engage however is easier. So without any further ado, I'll start with our first presenter today, Domenique Ciavattone. Where did I put your bio? Here it is. So Domenique is a second-year doctoral student at Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. Situated in geography, Domenique's research examines ontological diversity in rights of nature movements, focusing on efforts to grant legal personhood status to the oceans. Domenique holds an MA in climate change and global sustainability and a BA in global social justice and communication. Domenique conducted her MA thesis in Peru, where she collaborated with Quechua communities in the high Andes to strengthen conservation efforts and co-design a pluriversality to establish and decolonize transdisciplinary model of biocultural education. She has lived, worked, and studied in Brazil, Ecuador, Iceland, India, Italy, Kenya, South Africa, and Tanzania. So if you'll join me in welcoming Domenique with an applause reaction, I will let her take over.
Okay, hi. Thank you. Can you all see my presentation slide? Great.
Yes.
Pull up my. Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So I'll just dive in. The title of my presentation. I'm currently going into my third year of my PhD. So this is more of a dissertation proposal presentation. This is what I'll be working on for the next few years of my PhD. And it's entitled What, When, Where, Who is the Ocean? Putting Rights of Nature into Practice in Ontologically Multiple Fluid International Spaces. For a brief overview of what we'll be talking about, I'm going to start with going over an introduction and some context to the topic, some of the emerging threads that I'm seeing and how it's weaving into my own research, my research objectives and questions, some of my methods, and then outcomes and significance. So I'll start with, who am I? This is a very loaded philosophical and potentially existential question. But to answer in the context of my dissertation and positionality in this research specifically, I'm a settler scholar in the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit, known today as Newfoundland. And I grew up along the coast of the traditional land of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Picasset, and Wampanoag people in the so-called United States of America. I inherited my connection to and love for the ocean from my grandmother, pictured here on the coast of Massachusetts, who always taught me to revere and steward the water. During my master's program in climate change and global sustainability, I spent significant time learning about oceanic conservation with semesters in both Ecuador, with me with the tortoise in the Galapagos, and Iceland, with me kayaking in a fjord in Ísafjordur, comparing equatorial and Arctic environments. In Ecuador, I also studied rights of nature movements, which I'll talk about more in the coming slides. But why does this matter? Our oceans are dying. We're seeing the devastating effects of climate change on oceans with pollution, overheating, acidification, the list goes on. A lot of people in these sessions are addressing it and talking about it. And there's a need for urgent action, and many solutions are being proposed. In the humanities, we're seeing a blue turn and blue legalities, a hydrologic turn, blue humanities. We're also currently in the ocean decade. In 2017, the United Nations General Assembly declared 2021 to 2030 the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, also known as the Ocean Decade, which in the UN's words seeks to stimulate ocean science and knowledge generation to reverse the decline of the state of the oceans and catalyze new opportunities for sustainable development of this massive marine ecosystem. The vision of the ocean decade is quote, the science we need for the oceans we want. So my question is, who is we? Whose voices are being included? Does the ocean have a voice? This is where the rights of nature framework comes in. While many varying approaches are important, rights of nature adds a radically different approach to oceanic conservation, one that centers and deeply values more than human voices. So what are rights of nature? The Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, also known as GARN, defines rights of nature as the recognition that our ecosystems, including trees, oceans, animals, mountains, have rights just as human beings have rights. Rights of nature is about balancing what's good for human beings against what's good for other species, what's good for the planet as a world. It is a holistic recognition that all life, all ecosystems on our planet are deeply intertwined, rather than treating nature as property under the law. Rights of nature acknowledges that nature in all its life forms has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital life cycles. In action, we see rights of nature structured under two primary models. The rights of nature model, seen on the left, claims that all nature within legal jurisdiction has rights. It recognizes unique rights for ecosystems. Anyone can speak for nature, but is not obliged to and obligated to, and it's often reactive to reports of violations. On the right, we see the legal personhood model, granting rights to particular ecosystems, like the Wanganui River in New Zealand is the most famous case. Human rights are extended to ecosystems, and specific guardians are appointed to represent the ecosystem. And because the guardians are part of ecosystem management institutions, this approach is more proactive. A bit of the history of rights of nature, very briefly. Christopher Stone is credited with being the first in Western scholarship to propose inherent rights for nature, steeped in legal pragmatism. He wrote about conservatorship and guardianship, linking this idea to corporations and non-humans that already receive legal personhood. Stone's lesser acknowledged, but arguably more influential contemporary Chilean scholar Godfredo Stützen also generated foundational work on rights of nature. He argued for an ecological imperative to right wrongs and acknowledge nature with its own interests. His work was highly inspirational for scholars like Thomas Berry and Cormac Cullinan, who advocate for an earth-centered legal paradigm with nature's right to exist, to have habitat, and to evolve as part of the earth community. His important work reflects one of the many reasons why Latin America was and continues to be a driving force and legal leader in rights of nature. Rights of nature highlight the interconnectedness of humans and more than humans, and value natural entities for their inherent worth, but this is not something new. Stone, Stützen, the rights of nature movements certainly did not create this idea. The more recent scholarship and movements are preceded by millennia of indigenous knowledge systems. The idea of ethical relationality and the practices of reciprocity that guide rights of nature attempts to confront extractive neoliberal agendas come from indigenous knowledge systems. The first ever constitution to officially include rights of nature, Ecuador, was inspired by Sumac Causai, the Quechua cosmovision that promotes a harmonious totality of being. Since 2007, other countries have adopted rights of nature into their constitution, and many cases around the world have been brought forth to protect ecosystems or entities such as forests, rivers, mountains. But also, what is nature here? I'm talking a lot about nature, but how can we even define nature? This is yet another nebulous and philosophical question that I honestly could not even answer if this were a semester-long course rather than a 20-minute presentation. So I'm going to discuss nature in relation to, very specifically to this research. My research builds on the recent ontological turn in social sciences that assumes that, quote, nature is multiple, impossible to define in a singular manner. This builds on work of Marisol de la Cadena and Anne-Marie Moll. De la Cadena describes this as nature, but not only, and uses the example of a mountain to illustrate this concept. This is an image here of Alsangate, a very well-known mountain in Peru. And this mountain is an ancestor for local people. It is a container for gold for mining companies. For environmentalists, it is a complex ecosystem. For climbers, it is a series of roots and footholds. I stress is because these are not simple perspectives that different groups of people have on the mountain, but instead they are concrete versions of it, each implying very different kinds of relations with the referenced human groups. The same happens with the ocean. So what about oceans? Rights of nature has promise when applied to the ocean, but it faces some challenges. It's fluid. Oceans are fluid, constantly moving, liquid, it's solid sea ice, it's vapor, it's mist, it's constantly churning and mixing and transcending national boundaries. There's also the question that if we grant rights to one entity, what other entities do we have to grant rights to? At what point does the recognition stop? If the ocean, what about whales? What about plankton? What about waves? Are they not the ocean? The ocean has historically been fragmented in a divide and conquer-esque manner that allows for easier control over it. And this makes me think of other bodies, including my own. In the US, my home country, my teeth, my eyes are not considered to be part of my body. So to receive care, I have to pay extra for dental and vision. My body, like the ocean's body, is fragmented by law and politics. But in practice, I, like the ocean, am relational. I'm a body made up of bodies, and I am whole and in excess, a world of what Tim Ingold would refer to as open bindings. And then just to briefly talk about water ontologies, also what is ontology? In a very basic understanding and in the specific context of this research again, ontology is the study of being, theories of being, and what constitutes reality. Specific to water, it's ways of being with water and understanding the nature of water and human-water relations. Steinberg and Peters propose a more than wet ontology, in which they discuss the hypersea approach, which pushes us to think, in their words, to think of the ocean not as an isolated physical entity in distinct opposition to the land, but as a state of the hydrosphere that both in its overall state and in the properties of its individual molecules is perpetually in mutation and that is always exceeding the ocean's geographic boundaries. So building on De la Cadena's work from the earlier mountain example, and nature being nature but not only, I also consider the ocean as the ocean but not only. I explore the ocean as an extension in imaginaries, in senses. What does the ocean smell like, taste like, feel like? In umwelts of dolphins and seagulls, the ocean and bodies within the ocean is a spirit. It is a god. It is an ancestor. It is a hydrosphere. It is microbes. It is the water cycle. It is a carbon sink. It is the ocean, but certainly not only. So a way to challenge this is to apply a relational assemblage approach put forward by scholars like David and Kincaid, advocating to grant rights to relationships rather than entities as a practice to create a true paradigm shift. Granting rights to entities reinforces legal hierarchies and puts entities into competitions for rights when exercising laws, but relationships emphasize the interconnectedness and break down those hierarchies. Rights of nature have predominantly focused on specific entities or general constitutional rights within domestic jurisdictions, and of the current 543 eco-jurisprudence cases being tracked on the eco-jurisprudence monitor, only 18 relate to marine ecosystems. This chart emphasizes the comparative lack of marine influences and also shows the spike in cases after 2006 when the Ecuadorian Constitution granted rights to nature. So weaving knowledge, what are the emerging threads of my specific research? Currently, rights of nature is highly theoretical and tends to ignore the practical effects of these movements. So my research will focus on both the practical and the theoretical. Rights of oceans is also a new realm where water ontologies are meeting rights of nature, and historically rights of nature, when applied to water, has been predominantly in relation to rivers. Only in the past few years have we begun to see rights of ocean cases emerging. And why are oceans different? Rights of nature, as of yet, as typically established on national and domestic levels, whereas rights of oceans are unavoidably international. Rights of nature are applied to relatively defined entities, as I said before, and rights of oceans are very difficult to delimit. Rights of nature involve local communities quite often, and rights of oceans necessitate nation-state involvement. So my objectives with this research are to understand how and to what extent different demands and forms of relating to the ocean might be taken into account when granting rights to the ocean. To address this problem by seeking to identify the challenges and opportunities in integrating and prioritizing local voices in an international arena. and to inform domestic and international climate change and conservation policies. And some of the questions I'm asking, what differences does it make to move rights of nature from land-based to ocean-based settings, from national jurisdictions to international domains? How can rights of nature frameworks potentially reshape and impact human relationships with the ocean? When rights of nature discussions move to an international level, what spaces and opportunities exist or do not exist for local voices? And what are the practical effects of applying rights of nature frameworks to a shared, fluid ocean, particularly when considering power imbalances between stakeholders? My methods, very briefly, are situated in Latin American scholarship and indigenous decolonial thought, building on work from folks like Zoe Todd, Linda Tuai-Smith, Juanita Sundberg, Eduardo Gudinas, Kim Tallbear, and others, and also challenging the idea of expertise and centering non-dominant and more than human voices. It's iterative, emergent, and co-creative, working with established connections that I have in Brazil and Ecuador, having lived there, establishing new connections, and looking at literature. And the 4 case studies that I'm currently focusing on and exploring include Brazil, Ecuador, the Netherlands, and Canada, which are the only 4 places as of this moment that have established rights of oceans cases. Brazil recently granted rights to waves off the coast of Linhares, and this was an unprecedented decision. In the language of the law, it recognizes the waves' rights to continue breaking perfectly at the mouth of the Doce River and acknowledges the ocean as a living being subject to intrinsic rights to existence, regeneration, and restoration. These rights extend to an entire interconnected system of which the waves at the mouth of the Doce River are a part, encompassing the water bodies and living beings, including humans. So this is perhaps the most actualized relational approach of rights of oceans that we've seen. It's also just really beautiful in my eyes, the wording of that. Ecuador, I also talked about Ecuador being the, I'm sorry, Ecuador. Ecuador, again, granted rights to Pachamama, or Mother Earth, in a very loose translation of that word, in 2007. In 2010, when there was the BP oil spill off the Gulf of Mexico, Ecuadorian activists attempted to enact rights of nature from the Constitution to apply it to the ocean. And ultimately, the government denied that request, and it did not go any further because they said that the spill itself happened outside of the boundaries of the Ecuadorian border and was also not caused by an Ecuadorian national. And so that gets to the question of where is that boundary, right? And so now currently we're seeing some more movements in the Galapagos Islands to integrate rights of oceans and rights of nature in a place that is heavily dominated by scientific ontologies. And so where does that fit in? And the Embassy of the North Sea is one of the most fascinating examples of approaching law with oceans. They have created a long-term multi-phase plan that includes listening, speaking, and negotiating with the sea in what they claim is an exercise of watery politics. They're also working to rewrite United Nations ocean laws through more than human perspectives, which is unprecedented and fascinating. Canada also had the first actual rights of ocean petition and movement in 2022. They moved to grant rights to the Atlantic Ocean. This was the first official rights of ocean movement. It was happening off the coast of Newfoundland, where I'm living, and is currently stagnant. It hasn't really seen any movement since then. So I don't know what is happening with that, but it's telling as well that there's not much movement happening there. But it is another case. And so finally, the outcomes and significance. So my hope in an ideal world is that the results will shift the paradigm of ocean governance, offering actionable insights that resonate beyond academia, impacting policy and public awareness on local and global scales. By working with regional stakeholders, this research will create a forward-looking framework for how we share and liberate oceans and beings, including humans, who rely on and comprise them.
It was amazing. Thank you so much, Domenique. So much food for thought. So make sure you all keep it in mind as we move on to our next presenter now. So Make sure to save your questions for the end. So we're going to move to our next speaker, Mirna Šolić, who is lecturer in comparative literature at the University of Glasgow. So Mirna, please feel free to share your slides while I introduce you. Her current area of research are literary, cinematic, and visual representations of rivers, focusing on how creative interpretations of waterscapes, specifically rivers and lakes, contribute to our understanding of complex social transformation and contentious issues. Key themes include wartime traumas, rivers as watery graves, post-war identity, divided communities, deindustrialization and environmental issues, representations of rivers as transit point on global and local migration routes. While her primary focus is on post-war Balkans as well as Central Europe, she's interested in examining similar dynamics in other post-conflict and post-traumatic locations. Her first forthcoming article on the theme of Neither Here Nor There, Riverscapes in Films on Migration was accepted for publication in Modern Languages Open. Other forthcoming articles include Distributed Waters and Ohm Rivers, representation of Bosnia and Herzegovina's post-war riverscapes, submitted to national papers and at revision stage. And This Is My Lake and I Come to Live Here, Waterways as Sites of Displacement and Refuge, currently drafted and for consideration with Narodna Umjetnost, Croatian Journal of Ethnology and Folklore Research. Apology for my mispronunciation there. Her current impact spin-off initiative, The River Runs Through It, Emotion, Perceptions, and Memories on Both Sides of the Sava River, is supported by Impact Development Evaluation Fund, IDEF, focuses on the Sava River region, which is a triple border, interstate EU Schengen, and affected by the above-mentioned issues. And you can contact her on her email address at Glasgow if any aspect of her project is of interest. She's always welcoming collaborations. So if you join me in welcoming her with a clap emoji, I'll let her take over.
Thank you, Giulia, and thank you for the introduction. Just a small update. The first two articles mentioned are out, so I'm very happy to see them published. And so thank you also for having me in this seminar series. It's been wonderful, and I really hope that my presentation will contribute to this the fantastic program that you have. So anyways, today I'll be talking about rivers as sites of belonging in post-conflict narratives, and I'll be focusing on Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the theme will be disturbed waters and home rivers, and I will explain both terms as I go through my presentation. Hopefully everybody can hear me well. If you can't, do let me know, and I'll try to be louder. So today, I'm presenting part of my larger research project on representations of waterways in post-war and post-traumatic environments. In this presentation, I examine what meanings attributed to Bosnian rivers convey about Bosnian post-war identities and belonging as represented across cinematic, literary, and visual works. In doing so, this presentation seeks to address whether water can renegotiate meanings of the land-based homelands and to investigate how land-based attributes such as identity, memory, and belonging, intensified during the time of crisis, are represented and attributed to water rather than land. Through this process, I analyze how rivers offer alternative emotional geography, especially in situations when homelands are no longer perceived as homes and traditional forms of commemorations are difficult or impossible because of political reasons and other reasons as well. I will explore these themes by focusing on 3 rivers forming Bosnia's watery borders. This is my map, so it's quite basic, but I guess it can help. I begin with the Drina in the eastern Bosnian border with Serbia, and then I follow the Sava in the north westwards towards the Una River. As you can see, they're all interconnected. Such trajectory allows for mapping a water-based geography signaled by the water-based terminology in the title. The lexical choice of disturbed waters instead of disturbed soil and home rivers in place of homeland reflects this shift and suggests a movement, although not a strictly linear one, from the trauma of the wartime loss towards explorations of alternative forms of belonging in the post-war era. Disturbed water refers to disturbed soil, which is Vladimir Miladinović's large-size charcoal drawings based on small-size forensic photographs indicating positions of wartime mass graves commissioned by the International Crime Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. as well as his drawings of plants typically found on graves, suggesting organic decomposition in the soil. In forensic sciences, the term disturbed soil refers to the soil altered from its natural state, suggesting the presence of crime scene. However, in Serbian artist interpretation, disturbing the soil equals to, quote, reinterpretation of archival material, end quote, and the role of art in continuing discussions about war crimes 30 years on, almost 30 years on, across his former country. For Miladinovic, forensic photographs offer hard and undisputable evidence, but they say very little about our relationship with landscapes that still bear witnesses of crime. His approach aligns with scholarly approaches to post-traumatic landscapes, including the so-called scarred landscapes. But my project seems to address how to represent watery sites of suffering, which is quite elusive and perhaps not that easy to commemorate. In her discussion of the Plate River, which during Argentina's Dirty War became a grave to those deemed the enemies of the regime, Stella Schindel suggests that, in comparison to land, river is a, quote, space without place, a mass of water that never remains the same. The river challenges attempts to attach memories to it, end quote. I will address this issue by using Hrvoje Polan's photograph of the Mehmet Pasha Sokolović Bridge over the Drina in the town of Visegrad as an example, while bringing into discussion other visual representations of the river. I aim to demonstrate how photography can inscribe enduring presence of those who perished into the landscape and the consciousness of its viewers, rather than merely commemorating them. As the discussion progresses along the Sava and the Una, the term or the theme of disturbed water is weaved through other emerging topics, particularly belonging and homeland, whose terrestrial connotations are reshaped by the centrality of riverscapes in the narratives. In the title, this process is reflected by the use of the term home rivers instead of homelands. Merging the two words together into one suggests a transition to a new conceptual level in post-conflict environments. For humans, the concept of place is typically, quote, strongly associated with landed locations, end quote, while water may evoke, quote, a place of others or an other place, end quote. Recognizing water as place leads to transformative experience shaping individual communities and histories, quote, deterritorializing how we understand where we live and that we consider ongoing relations with others, whether these relations join us to other locations, other beings, or other events and space-times, end quote. My project highlights how this perspective is especially poignant in post-crisis situations when, for many people, land-based narratives may no longer provide ontological safety and the discourse they can identify with. The concept of the home river is particularly prominent in relation to the Sava and the Una, with Bekim Serjanovic's novel Your Son Huckleberry Finn and Faruk Šehić's Quiet Flows the Una, introducing a new type of life writing that includes multi-species relationships between humans and the river as a form of riverine citizenship. So, the Drina River. The wartime atrocities committed across the Drina River Valley, considered perhaps, quote, the largest mass grave of Bosnian victims of the 92 to 95 reign of murder in eastern Bosnia, end quote, have been represented in a few cinematic and photographic renditions documenting excavations of human remains. Ines Stanovic's short documentary film A Day on the Drina and Diana Muminovic's photo essay Secrets of Lake Peručac document the excavations of the temporarily dried up Peručac Lake on the Drina carried out by volunteers and family members of the deceased during the maintenance of the dam in 2010. Included into Killing Culture, a photo essay mapping cultural institutions across former Yugoslavia repurposed into sites of torture, Hrvoje Polan's photograph of the Mehmet Pasha Sokolović Bridge, the site of execution of the unknown number of Bosnian Muslims, is as much about the river as it is about the bridge as a monument of cultural importance. Poland captures the bridge by positioning the camera just under the water surface, with the clarity of the image partially blurred by the movement of water. The diagonal position of the bridge across the frame with its structure represented as if emerging from the river and reaching out towards one riverbank while leaving the other outside of the frame, suggests a physical and metaphorical disconnection between the two riverbanks. The rigid stone arch of the bridge is partially concealed, with its pillars obscured by the water. The aquatic elements from the river to the mist obscuring the surrounding hills conceals the solid ground. Pollan suggests that the choice of perspective reflects the difficulty of finding a novel approach to this cultural landmark on the UNESCO's World Heritage List. Another equally prominent point of consideration was ethical representation of crimes. Pollan's decision was to go with a single, quote, subjective frame, half from water, suggesting that this is how the last gaze on the bridge very possibly looked like for somebody whose throat was just cut, end quote. In other words, lingering, at least for a moment, in the liminal space between water and air, life and death, while gasping for the last breath, the disappeared are given a possibility to glance at the site of execution and witness the event of killing. Though silent in their presence, they're explicit in their vision of the bridge and granted a visual voice to provide a commentary about the absence of humans above victims and perpetrators, and the river which is, quote, merciless with anything that is put there, end quote. The erasure of any sort of explicit human presence, including the disconnection between the two riverbanks, is a powerful reflection on human history now captured from below. In the photograph, there is no return to the site of crime in terms of individual or communal mourning or finding evidences coming to terms with the past. Instead, the emphasis is on timeless presence in the landscape of those who disappeared, an attempt of, quote, being together after loss, end quote. Fragility or incompleteness are no longer important. No excavation of human remains or explicit presence of humans is necessary as a testimony of crimes. Instead, Pollan's approach, quote, disrupts conventional ideas of presence and absence, providing escape from both sensationalism and monumentalization, making it possible to touch or forgotten or excluded events, spaces, and subjects, end quote. In documentary storytelling, in this case previously mentioned Tanovic's and Muminovic's works, it is the absence of water which allows for the representation of the horror. A motive of a cracked and dried up lake bottom suggests the continuation of a violent mechanical intervention into control of historical narratives. In this case, water had to be removed for the bodies to be recovered, which is missing from Pollan's photograph. In Pollan's case, it is the uninterrupted presence of the river and its liquidity that generates meanings. The river gently crashing into the camera lens is an attempt of a sensory reconnection with the past events. In his photograph, it becomes a permanent marker of presence and loss. The Sava River. In fictional representations of the Sava River, the river as a watery grave, so strongly emphasized in relation to the Drina, is subtly woven into other narratives, depicting the Sava as a nostalgic yet anxious setting. This representational texture resonates with the river's constantly changing social and cultural perceptions, the fragile balance between the natural crossing connecting communities, histories, and cultures, and the dividing force of a border river, both in terms of a metaphorical and a political divide. Once a symbol of Yugoslav unity, as the longest Yugoslav river, the Sava now frequently embodies feelings of the physical and existential displacement. In addition to this, contemporary narratives present the Sava River as a site of physical and ontological entrapment, particularly from the Bosnian side, which you can also see on this illustration. In this context, Bekim Serjanovic's autobiographical novel Your Son Huckleberry Finn, a response to Mark Twain's coming-of-age narrative on the Mississippi River, features prominently in the emotional geographies of the river. From Norway, the protagonist returns to his river rather than his country, since he feels that there is no country to which he can return as a former refugee. This is not the case of diasporic nostalgia for an idealized past homeland that disintegrated into mud, which is the protagonist's metaphor for the post-war despair and corruption. His choice of the river instead of land is an attempt of reinventing the home by reorienting it towards the water rather than the terrestrial aspect of the former homeland. In the novel, the shift is expressed through the protagonist's inclination to see his life as a slow sail only for the purpose of sailing, which is seen as liberation from any attempt to belong. Sailing, both in real and ontological terms, is the act of resistance against bordering practices along the river, which are as absurd as they are indicative of the loss of the previous homeland and imposition of national and cultural affiliations that he can't identify with. In such circumstances, it was the return to the environment organized and guided by natural principles rather than human impact. As he says, quote, I returned regardless of the war, but as I said, not to the country, but to the river. Nothing else interested me anymore if it wasn't related to the Sava, the Danube, the Tisa, and some other rivers I sailed into because either the water level or the current allowed it, end quote. In the protagonist's emotional geography, the Sava region is a distinct world of its own, both as a natural and a social environment, with the river allowing the formations of new kinships, subverting land-based exclusionary narratives of belonging. Quote, the people of the river, end quote, who the protagonist encounters on the Sava's riverbanks are outsiders, either by choice or vagabonds historically deprived of land, without a prominent ethnic or nationalistic and national belonging or affiliation. The protagonist remembers their presence along other Yugoslav waterways, thus suggesting the riverine identity of the country as an alternative to the solid one, their own home river rather than political and now the former homeland. And finally, the Una River. So for Serjanović in the previous novel, Return to the Sava, as well as the idea of sailing off first to the Black Sea, the ultimate failure of which equals to sailing just anywhere, suggests that the fixed belonging is after all not possible. In the poem The Una, Faruk Šehić refers to the Una River as, quote, my river, in her I have recognized myself, end quote. Such self-identification with the river enables the creation of an alternative life-writing narrative where one's relationship with the non-human world takes priority over relationships with people whose absence from the book is deliberate. The riverine environment becomes a natural sanctuary for a former soldier where, quote, nothing bad could happen to me anymore, end quote. In the novel, that riverine microcosm, a counter-world-creating discourse, an entity larger than human, is an alternative to a failed homeland saturated with human-induced noises, reflecting brutality of adult masculinity, embodied in, quote, frowning, mustachioed men who perform tasks for the existence of our great and powerful state, end quote. Its solitude and silence makes the Una the world-formic catalyst of the narration, the home river. Diving into water restores natural memory deeply embedded into humans, yet erased from their awareness. It is seen as, quote, return to primordial caves adorned with seaweed, end quote, and the conscious act of crossing a threshold between the terrestrial and the aquatic self. An alternative to stereotypical war narratives is the Una as the river of joy. An illustration of this imagery is of, quote, incandescent swimmers while the summer sun sprays the air, end quote, continuing to swim during the wartime when the leisurely swim did not only bring people together, but it was also a strategic exercise of avoiding being shot by a sniper. The swimmers, the riverine people, are not outcasts from the society, as it was the case in Serjanović's novel, but the riverine citizens, to use Azra Hromadžić's term, with, quote, an effective and material attachment to the Una River, end quote. Commenting on the impact of life under siege in the town of Bihać on the Una River and its residents, it is, Azra Hromadžić writes, quote, how the river became an anchor and a compass that guided and situated Bišćani, the residents of the town of Bihać, living under siege in the larger context of life on earth, end quote. In her interpretation, riverine citizenship arises out of lived experiences of water as a natural, historic, and political environment, and love for the river characteristic of the Una and the identity of Bosnia itself. In Šehić's opus, there are implications that even the rivers of joy have not been spared from the burdens of human history. As the tributary of the Sava and part of the regional watershed of disturbed waters, the Una feeds into the network of watery graveyards and in this way locks Bosnia within the watery cycle of suffering. The view of Una's branch Unajik flowing past the narrator's grandmother's house brings memories of relatives who died in Jasenovac's concentration camp on the Sava in the Second World War. The Unajik merges with the Una, which then, quote, continues on alone without islands towards Jasenovac, end quote. Without islands is suggestive of the solitude of the river flowing through human lives and shaping them, quote, a river that wants to verify the world, our world prone to cyclical destruction, end quote, yet offering the only permanence in the capacity to remember and to witness. And finally, the conclusion. As one of the ethnographers said when he returned to the post-war Drina Valley, quote, with villages reduced to rubble and with no people in sight, they, the survivors, hardly recognized the area, only the river looked the same, end quote. However, has everything remained the same? Which emotions, meanings, and attitudes rivers reflect as part of post-war environments? How are they affected in the context of often radically changed environment and violent environments? In this article, I explore these questions by looking at entanglements between humans and rivers. I started with the way one of the most prolific conflict photographers from the region probed the limits of representation. In the Drina Valley, the site of mass atrocities where, quote, yet not a single public marker exists to commemorate mass executions from the bridge and other locations. Hrvoje Polan's photograph performs a commemorative function by using the river as the witness. My inquiry then continues to demonstrate other dominant connotations, in particular making sense of belonging in post-conflict world. In Bekim Sirjanovic's novel, the Sava becomes the riverine homeland, or rather the home river for the protagonist returnee, who refuses affiliation with land-based homeland. In Faruk Šehić's narrative, the river replaces the world of humans, forming the foundations of the riverine citizenship. However, despite life writing centered around the idyllic riverine world, this ontological creation remains fragile due to its connectedness to the troubled riverine network of the post-war region. In this way, literary and artistic renditions of this riverine geography of the country offer an important platform in preserving relationships between memory and landscapes, in expressing present sensibilities, and seeking alternatives beyond the obvious and the confining ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mirna, for this fascinating and interesting presentation. Today is really a treat. We've got such amazing presentation. And last but absolutely not least, we've got a group presentation coming up now. So I'll start introducing you, Lucas and Marije, and you can share slides if you have any. Lucas Rinzema is an independent researcher, writer, and filmmaker. He recently graduated from the Research MA in Arts, Media, and Literary Studies at the University of Groningen, and holds a BA degrees in philosophy and in arts, culture, and media from the same university. Currently, his research interests revolve around critical animal studies, ecofeminism, and film and media studies, with a specific focus on the, in parentheses, visibilities of violence and farm animals in contemporary animal industries. Marije Nieuwland is a second-year REMSC student in social sciences at the University of Amsterdam. Before, she studied cultural anthropology at the same university and focused on ethnomusicology, political anthropology, science and technology studies, STS, and multi-species anthropology. In 2023, she made a documentary film about hip-hop culture in DTube, Tbilisi, which sounds really exciting. If you can share that link, that'd be great. And wrote articles for the no, I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry. A research master project focuses on protest cultures and infrastructure in Tbilisi. And Mirna, I'm also going to put a message in if you want to share your articles. This is a great space if anybody wants to share the work they've done. If you join me in welcoming them with a little applause emoji, I will let them.
Thank you, Giulia. Yes, Lucas and I worked on a project together, and we want to share that with you today. And I want to start with a field note that I wrote. The field note is from quite some time ago, from March 2023. I want to take you with us to the port of Rotterdam, more precisely to the Merwe haven, a wharf as big as 5 soccer fields, filled with storehouses, container ships, and trucks. It is a loud place. Through the sound of the wind and the rain, you hear numerous engine noises. While workers are busy unloading and loading ships full of products from far destinations, you see seagulls taking what they can. The port of Rotterdam hosts a multi-species dinner. Because of the thousands of kilos of food stored in this wharf, many animals live and eat here. You can think not only of humans and gulls, but also mice, rats, crows, and cats. But you probably wouldn't think of cows. We find them on a float that subtly sways on the water of Merwe haven. It's a cold, cloudy, rainy day. We are standing in front of a small, recently plowed field. From the muddy fields, a bridge leads us to the float. A sour, inescapably strong smell of urine enters our noses. We notice the red buzzing manure robot that is fully covered with dung. It drives over the concrete floor, sweeping the dung to a corner where we notice the manure separator machine. This loudly rousing robot drowns out the sounds of other robots and the mooing of the cows talking to each other and greeting us. We are on the float together with 40 cows and a couple of crows. Some of the cows are laying in the cubicles, while others are drinking from the basin, eating hay through the fences, standing in line for the milking robot, or socializing with friends and with us. I wonder, would some of them prefer to go outside together on the fields? All are locked inside. As we learned later, they are not allowed to get off the float. When it rains, the meadow gets too puddly and the bridge too slippery. One time, a cow fell into the water. Firefighters took an hour to help her. Since then, all winter and every other rainy day in Rotterdam, and there are a lot of rainy days in Rotterdam, the cows of the floating farm are imprisoned on the float.
Okay. Thank you all for being here, and thanks Giulia and Sam for organizing this. I hope Marije's introduction gave you some sense of the strange, small, violent place we want to talk about, the floating farm. Well, you can see the slides, right?
Yes, very well.
Okay, great. The floating farm is, on a first glance, a contradictory place in a lot of ways. It is very much concerned about ecological crises and advocating small-scale projects to combat these crises, but it's also expansionist and industrial. It's looking for global solutions in a very nationalist way. It's futurist and conservative at the same time. What sticks out to us is that it's, in a lot of ways, it wouldn't advertise itself, continuous with conventional industrial practices of milk farming. You can see that in its barn that you can see here on the slides, which is conventional in its use of milking robots, manure robots, in its layout, its whole infrastructure, and in the circumstances under which cows live. It's also conventional in its the imaginaries and the narratives that surround the farm, which will mostly be the focus of this talk. what is particular about the floating farm is that these imaginaries and these narratives are all very much tied to water. So in the rest of this talk, we'll talk through various enactments or iterations of water at the floating farm. We'll build on our own fieldwork there at a lot of instances. We'll also build on a lot of web sources and on interviews with the founders of the farm. And in the end, we want to argue that water in its multiple iterations here coheres as a bio-industrial and human supremacist imaginary and project. So onto the first iteration of water that we want to talk about is what we call carceral water, which came to the fore in Marije's description just now, that the cows are locked up because the walkway is supposed to be too slippery most of the year. Water here becomes an obstruction for the cows, you could say, but it's also an excuse to imprison. It's good to question some aspects of the narrative around this, because the narrative is that the cow who fell in the water a few years ago slipped and fell, and that because of that it's necessary to keep the cows inside. It's important, I think, to question the necessity element of that narrative. Something very easily becomes framed as necessary, and necessity is often a way of justifying and legitimizing violence. It's also important to question the framing of farmed animals here, where the narrative is that she slipped and fell. That is, on the one hand, almost unbelievable, in the sense that there is a very high fence there that you just don't fall over. On the other hand, it's convenient for a human exceptionalist standpoint that she just slipped and fell. It's a very passive positioning of cows, where we could also tell stories of her fall being perhaps an act of resistance or desperation, or grief over lost calves who are only 100 meters away. For now, I want to quickly go back to those calves. If you take a few steps back, about 100 meters back off the driveway from the barn, you get to a little shed with cages where calves are housed. Usually it's only 1 or 2 calves because it's a small farm. So this is the place, the calves are also continuous with regular milk farming, separated with birth from their mothers so that they can farm, the farm can farm the milk. The first time we were there was only 1 calf, the one you can see here, imprisoned on their own. They spent the first few weeks of their lives lonely in these small cages, while humans look at them and mostly think they're cute. And this is what interests us. Like Catherine Gillespie, who's quoted here, we are interested in the way violence against certain lives and bodies can become so normalized that it's not viewed as violence at all. In the rest of this talk, we want to tackle some of the explanation of that phenomenon of invisibilizing violence by looking at the various roles what it takes at the floating farm. For the founders of the farm themselves, water is importantly ecological. They often tell their origin story of the farm, which is that the founder, Peter van Wingerden, was in New York in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy hit. Long supply lines were cut off, people were left without food. So he thought, I will make a climate adaptive farm with small supply chains that adapts to the water in case of a flood, that also the supply chains are short enough to be able to accommodate crisis situations. This informs the farm solutionist imaginary. They often engage in a polemics with their surroundings. For example, the crane you see here on the left is something Peter van Wingerden tends to point to as exactly what he's against. Minke van Wingerden, the other founder of the farm, told us that this is about the future food systems, thinking out of the box, doing things totally different. Why not? The problem with this solutionist imaginary is that it tends to neglect the specificities of ecological situatedness. Climate solutionism or ecological solutionism tends to take on these kinds of aesthetics, which leave out a lot. It leaves out that it uses the remainders of the neighboring industries, which is an exhaustive source if you want to scale it up, which Marije will come back to in a bit. It also leaves out the calves, for example, and doesn't take account of the fact that even as the founders told us, for now they are still buying 40% of the cow feed from non-circular sources. It's a simplification that can't deal with the specificities of ecological problems. And Marije will continue to talk about that.
Yeah, so the third enactment of water very much builds on what Lucas just told. And we borrow this concept from Jamie Linton, who wrote a book that is called Modern Water. And Jamie Linton writes that modern water is an idea of water as something apart from the broader social context in which it occurs. So like what Lucas just said about the ecological situatedness, that's completely ignored in this idea of modern water. And we very much recognize that in the vision book of the floating farm. So when Peter van Wingerden and Minke van Wingerden, they're a couple, by the way, they're married. When they founded the farm, they wrote this vision book. I think it's together with also a lot of organizations that help with the money for the floating farm, including, I think, University of Wageningen even.
Yeah.
That's good to mention. So there's a quote on the PowerPoint right now from the vision book. The floating farm will use the space on the water to relieve pressure on the land. And I think this very much shows this idea of modern water, because the water is very much portrayed as something universal, a-relational, and independent, and it's everywhere the same. So, for example, they have this idea that the floating farm, that it can go to Singapore, it can go to New York, it can go to like everywhere where there is water. And in that sense, you also see a very expansionist logic that the floating farm has. Like you see on the screen right now, that the floating farm is very much scalable as well. And that brings me to Tsing. So Tsing writes that scalability is expansion without any change in project frames. And that is also how the floating farm is perceived, and that you can just make it bigger. And what we noticed is that they don't think about what changes if you, for example, have instead of 40 cows, 400 cows. How do you then make it circular? How do you then make it sustainable? Because like these goals are right now for them already very hard to accomplish. Sorry. And if you make it even bigger, that's even more complex. And also like all kinds of local complexities that different beings that you have in different countries and different cultures, and they really don't take that into account. Yes, and there's another quote of Anat Singh, that the float and progress is a forward march, drawing other kinds of time into its rhythms. And we really see this at the floating farm as well, that it's very much a modernist project, taking the narrative of and shape of progress. Then the fourth enactment of water, and that we call nationalist water. And I have a really nice film still up here. And this is, yeah, for me, a very fascinating image, because you see the windmill in the middle. And in the Netherlands, for people, this is a very nostalgic view of what the Netherlands is. But then around, you have the port of Rotterdam, the largest seaport in Europe, very important also for this country, and something else that people are very proud of, that we have this enormous seaport. And I think it's interesting how that comes together on this picture. It's like nostalgic Netherlands and futuristic Netherlands in the same image. Here I have some pictures of the little store in the floating farm, because you can visit the floating farm. They're very welcoming. It's also the government of Rotterdam invites people to go there to look at the cows, and people take their kids there. It's very much an activity. But you can also buy products there, and you can have a coffee with some kind of cheesecake made from the milk, of course. And there is this interesting aesthetic that they have in the shop that is very nostalgic and Dutch and old, and kind of giving you this feeling that you're in like this Dutch tradition. Then I have a quote on the screen right now that's also from the vision book, and it says, "Because the Dutch have been living with and on the water for 100 years, farming on the water is no science fiction, but a logical step into the future." I think what's interesting up here is how the past is connected to the future, and how it's being made into like this tradition of the Dutch conquering the water, and like these whole myths of like colonial myths that we have as well. Yes. Oh, I'm using my notes. Yes. Oh. Okay, I want to get back to nostalgic futures. We have this article by Stanescu, and Stanescu has this term pastoral ideal, and it says, "A desire to return to a non-existent past, which falsely romanticizes ideals of a local-based lifestyle." And in an interview with Minke, we asked her some questions about the floating farm, and about like why she thought that Rotterdam needed this farm and the port of Rotterdam. And she said, "I grew up in the countryside. We have 2 sons who grew up in the city. What I think in retrospect is that if you don't connect with where your food comes from, that's a loss." And this really shows why she wants to have the farm in the city and close to the people in the city, because she thinks it's a problem that people don't know where their food comes from. And she's like, okay, we need to bring it closer to the people. So let's bring the cows into the city in this farm. So I think what is interesting is that you, on the one hand, see this desire to return to this past, this nostalgic past. But on the other hand, also this very futuristic idea that's like full of technological solutionism and very progress oriented and expansionist. And now I give it back to Lucas again.
To conclude our talk, we want to quickly reflect on the ways these various iterations of water hang together, what we call water multiple, and what we argue is a form of bioindustrial human supremacist coherence. For multiplicity, we draw on Annemarie Mol's work, who argues that objects exist in a multiple sense and that they engage different relations at different moments. So there's no sort of positivist steady center to the object, but importantly, this does not mean that they fragment or fall apart. But she writes that multiple objects tend to hang together somehow. Let me see where I am, sorry. Oh yeah, I can to note a few things about coherence of watery imaginaries here. Progress toward technical mastery of the world and water as an ecological threat are both part of a nostalgic nationalist narrative. And modern water as an empty space is part of both ecological solutionism and nationalist nostalgia. So they hang together in a way that constitutes a very Dutch, heroically solutionist technical subject position. That's also very much human and very much colonial and white, I would say. But that's a topic for another paper. But the humanity of it is interesting because we argue that water multiple here coheres as human supremacy and that it renders cow lives illegible and leaves no room for them as subjects of concern or care. It's difficult from within this framing, all these coherences of watery imaginaries, to see cows as political subjects. This does something to their legibility and the way their communication and their language is read. It institutes what Eva Meyer would call a negative stereotype of other animals as mute or incapable of speaking, and an idealized view of the human and human language. So in these watery imaginaries tied to human supremacy, what did I say? Cows become illegible even when you can walk into the barn at the floating farm. It's a very accessible place. It's a place where cows become very visible but not legible because of these confluences with water. So we'd like to close off openly by pointing out that cows are intelligent, social speaking beings, linguistic agents who even under poor conditions form rich and complex relationships with the world to make it a meaningful place, as Leonie Cornips and Louis van den Hengel write. And we want to note that there is always still a lingering potential that we think we should pursue to see and hear places and the beings who live there beyond human supremacist imaginaries. Thank you.
Thank you.